I'm about to tell you the story of a man who changed the course of history forever, yet most people have never heard his name. While you know about William the Conqueror, Henry VIII, and Elizabeth I, there's one king who came before them all, a ruler whose very existence made England possible. His name was Athelstan, and he didn't just inherit a throne, he forged an entire nation from the ashes of a fractured land. Picture this, it's the 10th century, Britain is carved up between warring Saxon kingdoms and Viking raiders, and nobody, absolutely nobody, believes that this patchwork of territories could ever become one unified realm. But one man dared to dream the impossible, and his story is so extraordinary, so filled with betrayal, warfare, and political genius, that it reads like the greatest fantasy epic ever written. The twist? Every word of it is true, and by the end of this video, you'll understand how one forgotten king became the architect of England itself. To understand Athelstan's impossible rise, I need to take you back to a time when England didn't exist, not as we know it today. The year is 899 AD, and what we now call England is a chaotic mosaic of 7 separate kingdoms, each with its own king, its own laws, and its own fierce independence. The Saxons control most of the south, Wessex, Kent, Sussex, and Essex, while the Angles dominate the north and Midlands, with Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria. But here's where it gets interesting. These aren't just different kingdoms. They're different peoples, with different languages, different customs, and centuries of blood feuds between them. Add to this the constant threat of Viking invasions from the north and Danish settlements throughout the eastern territories, and you have a recipe for perpetual warfare. Into this world of endless conflict, a child was born around 894 AD, a boy, who would grow up to be called Athelstan, though his path to the throne was anything but certain. He wasn't born to be king. He was the illegitimate son of Edward the Elder, King of Wessex, and his status as a bastard should have disqualified him from ever wearing a crown. Yet sometimes, I've learned, the most unlikely candidates become the most extraordinary leaders, and Athelstan's story was just beginning to unfold in ways that would shake the very foundations of medieval Britain. Growing up as the illegitimate son of a king in medieval England wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous. I can only imagine what it must have been like for young Athelstan, watching his legitimate half-brothers receive the education, the attention, and the respect that he could only dream of. Edward the Elder had multiple wives and concubines, which meant Athelstan had numerous siblings, but his birth mother's lower status marked him as different from day one. The court whispers must have followed him everywhere. There goes the bastard prince, the one who'll never rule. But here's what makes Athelstan's early years so fascinating. Instead of being hidden away or marginalized, he was sent to be raised by his aunt Athelstan, the Lady of the Mercians, one of the most powerful and respected rulers of her time. This wasn't exile, it was education of the highest order. Athelstan wasn't just any noblewoman, she was a warrior queen who had successfully defended Mercia against Viking invasions, expanded her territory through strategic alliances, and earned the respect of every kingdom in Britain. Under her tutelage, Athelstan learned not just how to fight, but how to think strategically, how to build coalitions, and most importantly, how to see beyond the narrow confines of individual kingdoms to envision something greater. But why would Edward the Elder send his illegitimate son to such a powerful ally? The answer to that question would determine the fate of England itself. The year 918 changed everything for Athelstan, though he didn't know it yet. Athelstan died suddenly, and with her death, the delicate balance of power in medieval Britain began to shift dramatically. Mercia, the powerful kingdom that had served as a buffer between Wessex and the Viking territories, was now vulnerable, and every neighboring ruler was calculating their next move. Edward the Elder moved quickly. annexing Mercia directly into Wessex and effectively doubling his territory overnight. But this expansion came with Apris. Suddenly, Edward wasn't just the King of Wessex. He was the most powerful ruler in southern Britain, and that made him a target for every ambitious warlord from Scotland to Cornwall. I can picture Athelstan during this tumultuous period, now in his mid-20s, watching his father navigate the treacherous waters of medieval politics. While he remained on the sidelines, still the bastard son with no clear path to power. But Edward was beginning to see something in Athelstan that others missed, a combination of diplomatic skill and military prowess that could prove invaluable in the coming struggles. When Edward needed someone to lead a crucial military campaign against rebellious Welsh princes in 920, he didn't choose one of his legitimate sons. He chose Athelstan. The decision shocked the court and set tongues wagging across every kingdom in Britain. Was this simply a practical choice? Or was Edward beginning to see his illegitimate son as something more than a useful tool? Edward the Elder died in 924, and what happened next should have been straightforward according to medieval law and custom. The crown should have passed to one of Edward's legitimate sons, Alfred or Edmund, both of whom had stronger legal claims than their illegitimate half-brother. But here's where Athelstan's story takes its first dramatic turn. Alfred died just 16 days after his father, leaving the succession in chaos. Suddenly, the bastard prince, who had spent his entire life preparing for a life in the shadows, found himself thrust into the spotlight as a legitimate claimant to the throne of Wessex. The Witan, the council of nobles who had the power to choose the king, faced an unprecedented decision. They could choose Edmund, who was young and relatively inexperienced, or they could take the radical step of crowning an illegitimate son. The debates must have been fierce, with some nobles arguing that blood legitimacy was paramount, while others pointed to Athelstan's military successes and diplomatic skills. What swayed them wasn't just Athelstan's qualifications. It was the recognition that the kingdom faced threats that required an experienced leader, not a learning king. But even as the Witan debated, powerful forces were moving against Athelstan. The Mercian nobles, despite their recent annexation, weren't entirely comfortable with Wessex rule, and many saw this succession crisis as an opportunity to reassert their independence. The Vikings in the north were watching carefully, ready to exploit any sign of weakness, and perhaps most dangerously, there were whispers that some of Edward's supporters were already plotting to challenge Athelstan's legitimacy before he could even be crowned. The question that haunted everyone was simple: could a bastard king really unite a fractured realm, or would his coronation be the spark that ignited a civil war? When Athelstan was finally crowned King of Wessex in 925, the ceremony was notably subdued compared to previous royal coronations. Many of the great nobles stayed away, sending messages of congratulations, but avoiding the political statement that attendance would represent. I can imagine Athelstan standing in that ancient hall, the crown heavy on his head, knowing that every person present was calculating whether he would survive his first year as king. The challenges came immediately, and from every direction. The Kingdom of Mercia, despite its official annexation, was riddled with nobles who resented Wessex rule and saw the new king's questionable legitimacy as a weakness to exploit. In the north, the Viking kingdoms of York and Dublin were forming new alliances, sensing opportunity in the political instability. But perhaps most threatening of all were the whispers within his own court. Rumors that legitimate heirs would soon return to claim what was rightfully theirs. Athelstan's response to these challenges revealed the strategic genius that would define his reign. Instead of ruling from the traditional Wessex strongholds, he began a series of royal progresses that took him to every corner of his realm, dispensing justice, hearing grievances, and most importantly, showing himself to his people as their undisputed king. He understood something that many medieval rulers missed. Legitimacy isn't just about bloodlines, it's about perception, and perception could be shaped through action. When Mercian nobles tested his authority by refusing to pay tribute, Athelstan didn't send armies. He went himself with a small retinue and challenged their leaders to single combat if they questioned his right to rule. The audacity of this move, the sheer confidence it demonstrated, began to shift the narrative around his reign. But just as Athelstan was beginning to consolidate his power within his own kingdoms, a new threat emerged that would test everything he had learned about leadership, diplomacy, and war. Here's where Athelstan's story takes a turn that most historians miss, but which reveals the true genius of England's first king. In 927, just 2 years into his reign, Athelstan received an unexpected embassy from Hywel, the most powerful Welsh king. The message was simple but revolutionary. Instead of the traditional tribute and submission that Welsh rulers offered to their more powerful Saxon neighbours, Hywel proposed something unprecedented, a full military alliance between equals. But this wasn't just any alliance. It was a proposal that would fundamentally change how power worked in medieval Britain. Hywel wasn't offering to become Athelstan's vassal. He was offering to become his partner in creating something that had never existed before, a unified Britain under joint rule. The proposal was so radical, so far beyond conventional medieval thinking, that most of Athelstan's advisors recommended rejecting it outright. Why would a Saxon king share power with a Welsh ruler? Why risk the fury of his own nobles by treating foreign kings as equals? But Athelstan saw something his advisors missed. This wasn't about sharing power, it was about multiplying it. A true alliance with Wales wouldn't just add Welsh troops to his armies. It would send a message to every other kingdom in Britain that the old rules were changing. If Saxon and Welsh kings could work together as equals, what did that mean for the traditional hierarchies that had kept Britain fractured for centuries? The decision to accept Hywel's proposal was perhaps the most important moment in Athelstan's reign, but it was also the most dangerous. By agreeing to treat a Welsh king as an equal partner, Athelstan was essentially declaring that he envisioned a new kind of kingdom, one based not on Saxon supremacy, but on something far more radical. The idea that different peoples could unite under one crown while maintaining their distinct identities. The Welsh alliance proved to be exactly the catalyst Athelstan needed, but it also triggered the greatest crisis of his reign. In 934, a coalition of northern powers began forming that would make or break his dreams of a unified Britain. Constantine II of Scotland, Olaf Guthfrithson of Viking Dublin, and Owen of Strathclyde, 3 of the most powerful rulers in the British Isles, secretly agreed to coordinate their attacks on Athelstan's expanding kingdom. But here's what makes this conspiracy so fascinating. It wasn't just about stopping Saxon expansion. These rulers had recognized something that many historians have missed. Athelstan wasn't just conquering territory, he was creating a new model of kingship that threatened the very foundations of how power worked in medieval Europe. If Athelstan succeeded in uniting Britain under a single crown while allowing different peoples to maintain their cultural identities, he would have created something unprecedented, a multi-ethnic kingdom held together not by force alone, but by mutual benefit and shared purpose. The Northern Conspiracy was as much about stopping this revolutionary idea as it was about preventing Saxon domination. Constantine II in particular understood the threat. As King of Scotland, he had spent his entire reign maintaining Scottish independence against Saxon pressure, but Athelstan's new approach posed a different kind of challenge. If the Saxon king could successfully integrate Welsh, Mercian, and other peoples into his kingdom as partners rather than subjects, how long before Scottish nobles began to wonder if their own independence was worth the constant warfare and economic isolation The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just who ruled Britain, but what Britain would become. The question that haunted every ruler from Scotland to Cornwall was simple. Could Athelstan's revolutionary vision of unified diversity survive the test of war? By 937, the Northern Coalition had grown into something far more dangerous than Athelstan had initially anticipated. What had started as a traditional alliance of convenience had evolved into a crusade against everything Athelstan represented. Constantine II had managed to convince Olaf Guthfrithson that defeating Athelstan wasn't just about maintaining Viking independence, it was about preserving the ancient ways of kingship against a Saxon ruler who threatened to change the very nature of power itself. The irony wasn't lost on contemporary observers. Viking kings, Scottish kings, and Celtic princes were uniting to stop a Saxon king who preached unity and cooperation. But that's exactly what made Athelstan so dangerous. To the established order, his vision of Britain wasn't about Saxon conquest, it was about creating something entirely new. As reports reached Athelstan's court about the size of the gathering army, the magnitude of the challenge became clear. This wasn't just another border skirmish or succession dispute. This was a war for the soul of Britain itself. Constantine had assembled the largest military coalition in British history, with armies from Scotland, Ireland, and the Welsh kingdoms that had rejected Athelstan's alliance. Viking longships were arriving daily at Scottish ports, carrying seasoned warriors eager for the plunder that would come from sacking the rich Saxon cities. The combined forces numbered in the tens of thousands, a massive army by medieval standards, and one that dwarfed anything Athelstan could field from his own kingdoms. But here's where Athelstan's years of building alliances and creating partnerships paid off in ways that his enemies never anticipated. When he called for troops to defend against the northern invasion, the response revealed just how successful his revolutionary approach to kingship had been. Welsh princes, who had initially been skeptical of his alliance, now sent their best warriors. Mercian nobles, who had once resented Saxon rule, now rallied to defend their king. Even Danish settlers in the Eastern Territories, who might have been expected to support their Viking cousins, chose to stand with Athelstan instead. The armies met at Brunanburh in late 937, and what happened there would echo through history. For 1,000 years, I wish I could have been there to witness the moment when Athelstan looked across the battlefield and saw the largest army ever assembled against an English king. Constantine's coalition stretched as far as the eye could see: Scottish spearmen, Viking berserkers, Irish warriors, and Welsh rebels, all united in their determination to stop the Saxon king who dared to dream of a unified Britain. But when Athelstan looked at his own forces, he saw something his enemies couldn't understand, an army that represented his vision made manifest. Saxon thanes fought alongside Welsh princes, Mercian cavalry charged beside Danish settlers, and Northumbrian archers provided cover for troops from a dozen different kingdoms. This wasn't just Athelstan's army, it was Britain's army, the first truly unified British force in history. The battle itself was one of the bloodiest and most decisive in medieval warfare. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes it as the greatest battle fought on British soil since the Roman conquest, and archaeological evidence suggests that the fighting was so intense that bodies were still being discovered centuries later. But what made Brunanburh special wasn't just its scale, it was what it represented. For the first time in British history, different peoples were fighting not for their individual kingdoms, but for a shared vision of what Britain could become. When Constantine's charge broke against Athelstan's shield wall, when Olaf's Vikings found themselves outflanked by Welsh cavalry, when the Scottish spearmen realized they were surrounded by enemies who fought with the coordination of true allies, rather than the loose cooperation of a temporary coalition, the old order of British politics died on that battlefield. By the end of the day, Constantine was in retreat, Olaf was dead, and the Northern Coalition had been utterly destroyed. But the real victory wasn't military. It was political and cultural. Athelstan had proven that his vision of Britain wasn't just a dream. It was a reality that could defend itself against any enemy. After Brunanburh, something fundamental changed in how Athelstan was perceived, not just by his own subjects, but by rulers across Europe. The titles that had once seemed presumptuous, King of the Anglo-Saxons, King of Britain, Emperor of the English, now carried weight backed by undeniable military and political success. But here's what I find most remarkable about Athelstan's response to his greatest victory. Instead of using it as an excuse for harsh retribution against his enemies, he used it as an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of king he truly was. When Scottish and Welsh prisoners were brought before him, expecting execution or slavery, Athelstan offered them a choice: return to their homelands with a message of peace, or stay and become part of the unified kingdom he was building. Many chose to stay, and their descendants would become some of the most loyal supporters of the English crown for generations to come. This wasn't just magnanimity, it was strategic genius. Athelstan understood that lasting unity couldn't be built on conquest alone. It required the willing participation of all Britain's peoples. The court that emerged in the years after Brunanburh was unlike anything that had existed before in European history. Welsh bards performed alongside Saxon poets, Scottish engineers worked on English castles, and Viking traders brought goods from across the known world to markets protected by English law. For the first time, someone walking from Cornwall to Northumberland would be travelling through a single kingdom, governed by consistent laws, protected by unified defences, and enriched by the free movement of people and goods across traditional boundaries. But perhaps most importantly, Athelstan established something that would outlast even his own remarkable reign. The idea that England was not just a collection of Saxon kingdoms, but a nation that belonged to all its peoples. The legal codes he established recognized Welsh law alongside Saxon law, acknowledged Danish customs alongside English customs, and created a framework for unity that didn't require uniformity. When Athelstan died in 939, just 2 years after his greatest triumph, he left behind something that no British ruler had ever created, a unified England that was stronger than the sum of its parts. But here's the tragedy that has haunted his legacy for over 1,000 years. The very success of his vision made later generations forget how revolutionary it had been. By the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, England was so unified, so clearly a single nation, that it seemed natural and inevitable. The idea that Britain had once been 7 separate kingdoms, that unification had once seemed impossible, that it had taken a bastard king with a revolutionary vision to make it happen, all of this faded from popular memory. Later kings would claim credit for creating England, but they were really just inheriting and maintaining what Athelstan had built. William the Conqueror conquered a unified England. He didn't create it. Henry II ruled over a centralized kingdom. He didn't forge it from warring territories. Elizabeth I presided over a confident nation. She didn't have to convince different peoples that they belonged together. Every great English king and queen who came after Athelstan built upon the foundation he had laid, yet somehow his name was forgotten while theirs were remembered. Part of this historical amnesia comes from the nature of Athelstan's achievement. Successful unity looks inevitable in retrospect, making the architect of that unity seem less important than those who came later. But I think there's something deeper at work here. Athelstan's vision of England was so successful that it became the natural order, and the natural order doesn't seem to require explanation or celebration. When tourists visit England today, they see a country that has been unified for over 1,000 years, a nation where Welsh, Scottish and English identities coexist within a broader British framework. They don't think about how unprecedented this was, how it required a king with the vision to imagine something that had never existed and the skill to make it reality. Standing here in the 21st century, looking back across more than a millennium of English history, I can see why Athelstan's story matters now more than ever. In an age when the world seems increasingly divided, when unity appears impossible across ethnic, cultural and religious lines, the example of England's first king offers a different model. Athelstan didn't create unity by forcing everyone to become the same. He created unity by showing that different peoples could work together while maintaining their distinct identities. The England he forged wasn't a melting pot that dissolved differences, but a tapestry that was stronger because of its varied threads. Think about what this means for our modern world. When politicians talk about unity today, they often mean uniformity. Everyone believing the same things, sharing the same values, speaking the same language. But Athelstan's England shows us a different path. His kingdom thrived because Welsh princes brought their military innovations, because Danish settlers contributed their trading networks, because Scottish craftsmen shared their techniques. Unity didn't require giving up what made each group special. It required finding ways to make those differences complementary rather than competitive. The legal and political frameworks Athelstan established, frameworks that recognized multiple legal traditions within a single kingdom, that allowed for cultural diversity within political unity, that created prosperity through cooperation rather than domination. These weren't just medieval innovations. They were blueprints for how diverse societies can work together in any era. But perhaps most importantly, Athelstan's story reminds us that the most transformative changes in history often come from the most unlikely sources. He was a bastard prince who shouldn't have inherited anything, leading a kingdom that shouldn't have existed, creating a nation that everyone said was impossible. If the forgotten king of a fractured medieval realm could forge lasting unity from seemingly irreconcilable differences, what does that say about the challenges we face today? As I finish telling you Athelstan's story, I want you to imagine something. Imagine walking through London, Edinburgh, Cardiff, or any city in modern Britain. Look around at the incredible diversity, people from dozens of different ethnic backgrounds, speaking dozens of different languages, practicing dozens of different religions, all living together in a society that, despite its problems, has achieved a level of peaceful coexistence that would have seemed miraculous to medieval observers. Now imagine trying to explain to Athelstan that the unified kingdom he created would one day encompass not just Saxons, Welsh and Danes, but people from every continent on earth. I think he would have understood immediately the principle he established, that unity is stronger than uniformity, that diversity is a source of strength rather than weakness, that lasting peace comes from cooperation rather than conquest. These principles didn't just create medieval England. They created the foundation for everything that came after. Every time the British Parliament passes a law that applies equally to all citizens, regardless of their background, they're following Athelstan's precedent. Every time someone born in Scotland can work in England or someone from Wales can study at Oxford, they're benefiting from the unified kingdom he created. Every time Britain faces a crisis and its people come together as one nation while maintaining their distinct regional and cultural identities, they're proving that his vision was not just successful but enduring. The ultimate irony of Athelstan's legacy is that he succeeded so completely that his achievement became invisible. England is so unified, so clearly one nation, that we forget it was ever anything else. But kingdoms don't unify themselves. Nations don't create themselves. And the complex, tolerant, diverse society we see in modern Britain didn't emerge by accident. It all began with one forgotten king who dared to imagine that enemies could become allies, that strangers could become neighbors, and that a collection of warring tribes could become a single people. Athelstan may be the most important king you've never heard of, but his legacy surrounds us every day. He didn't just create England, he created the idea that unity and diversity aren't opposites, but partners. And in a world that desperately needs that lesson, maybe it's time we remembered the bastard prince who became the first king of England, and in doing so, changed the course of history forever.